So as we have been going these past few weeks, trying to imagine and trying to see the face of God in different ways, and having read this story this morning, it made me think, Sarah, the mother, made me think of my own mother, and many of you know that my mother, for me, was a very important embodiment of grace and very much a person like we all do in our lives, often our parents or someone I could see the face of God in. She was an interesting person. She was abandoned as a baby, was raised in a foster home where, as she was raised, she took care of other babies. She was never adopted. She was raised by the city of Dallas. And she was the only young woman to graduate from high school from that foster home. She was a career woman when she graduated from high school, was a secretary, which in the 50s was about all that was available for women. And, my mom never had much, no power, no privilege, not even parents. And yet, I think most who knew her felt like they could see the face of God in her. And there was one particular moment in my life where I saw the face of God in her. And I love this story, and so it's possible I may have I've said it here. It's one of the challenges of preaching after a while is you forget which stories you tell. I'm not sure if I've told this story here, but it's a small story, but a formative story for me. And it's a story that occurred when I was about 12 years old. And I had invited my best friend over, and it was kind of a fun time because my mom and dad were going to a party across the alley, in the next door neighbor's house. And so it was one of the first times that we at 12 had been left alone on our own. It was only less than a couple of houses down, so it felt pretty safe. And my mom was telling us, don't do this, don't do that, and we were rather offended that we 12-year-old boys couldn't take care of ourselves. And I remember the last words she said as she left the house was she told us, don't run in the house. Well, the minute she left, the minute they left and went to the party, my friend and I loved to play football, and we proceeded to play football in the house, running around. Now, we weren't fools. We used a Nerf football, not a real one. And we ran around the house. And there was at one point at which my friend was chasing me. And as we're running through the house, I hear this huge crash. And my friend kind of scream out. And so I run back and I discover that we in our running had knocked down my mom's brand new wooden chair to the brand new dining room set. And the very top of it had broken off. Now we knew the world was going to end. So we did what any normal 12-year-old boys do. What did we do? We tried to cover it up. So I was rather ingenious at this. I think a pretty sneaky kid. And so I got glue, Elmer's glue, and brown shoe polish. And we attached the top, glued it, attached it back to the top. I think we'd had the dining room set. My mom had had it all of 1 week. And so I did it, and I got the brown shoe polish. And I think we would have gotten away with it if at that moment she didn't knock on the door, because the door was locked, and saying, "Why is this door locked?" Well, we tried to keep it up, and so I threw the brown shoe polish and the rag and the glue into the utility room, and then let my mom in, and she knew something was up. Later, she told me, well, it was the smell of glue in the air and the brown shoe polish on your hands and face that gave you away. So she says, what's happened here? And we did, like any normal 12-year-old boys, we turned on each other and said it was his fault. But eventually, we finally confessed and told my mom and showed her her brand new dining room wooden chair with this shoe-polished crack at the very top of it. And I remember that moment because I remember my mother's face, which began to get redder and redder and redder, and her eyes began to bulge. And I knew in that moment I was going to experience the wrath of God, right? We deserved punishment, and my mom was going to explode and bring down the wrath of God. And I remember watching her get redder and redder, and her eyes began to bulge more and more until all of a sudden she broke out laughing. And tears started going down her face. She was laughing and laughing and laughing so hard. And I remember thinking at the time, I broke my mom. I mean, that's a small story. It's a true story. She confessed to me later she was just worried we were sniffing glue. And was relieved. She later said it was kind of hysterical with all the shoe polish on your face and hands. But I remember that image of her laughing and laughing and laughing, that it became an image of the face of God to me, of grace. Because what is grace but this expectation of judgment and condemnation and punishment? What is grace but instead a moment of laughter? That is the image of God to me in the face of a mother laughing. So I thought of that story as I read the story of Sarah this morning. Here is Sarah. These three strangers come, these three strangers representing God, and they ask, where is your wife, to Abraham? And Abraham says, well, she's in the tent. And then they say to him these words, when we come back this way again, she will have borne you a son. And what does Sarah do? The text says she laughed to herself. Now, why did she laugh to herself? In fact, God is curious about that. The Lord asks Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And I like that question because I think it's easy to understand why Sarah would laugh. The sheer unbelievability of the grace of God that would bring her child. She was, in the days, in the time and culture, she was an old woman, and rather discretionary, the text says, she was not in the way of women anymore. No wonder she laughed at the sheer ridiculousness of that possibility. No wonder she laughed in disbelief at the very possibility, at her age, that she could give birth to something. And we should understand that Sarah, in her time and in her culture, that very patriarchal culture, the only value, in many ways, a woman had was to give birth, was to have children. And a woman who didn't have children was powerless, was made fun of her whole life. And here is Sarah, who hears the words, here she is in her old age and told she will give birth to her son. I imagine her laughter is kind of ironic in a way. Here she was, powerless and barren her whole life, kind of laughing at the cosmic joke of it all, that somehow God could create life when it seemed impossible. And so she laughed in disbelief. She laughed ironically, I think. And it's interesting, this line in the very end of that story, when she's asked, why do you laugh? It says she kind of lies about it. I didn't laugh. And it says the reason is she was afraid. What was she fearful of? And I've often thought about that. What was she afraid to admit that she laughed? It was not surprising that she would laugh at the sheer disbelief, the sheer possibility that God could do this. I think she didn't want to confess she laughed because she really didn't want to believe in the possibility of grace that would bring life from barrenness. I think she found it incredibly hard to believe that that possibility existed. And to confess she laughed would be to admit in the possibility of God doing something. Now, that's an interesting story and one that has a lot of meaning and a lot of possibilities. But it's an interesting story, particularly in the day and age in which we live right now. We live in a time of great conflict and confrontation. We live in a time of anxiety and fear. A time where it's very hard for us, in some ways, to hope and imagine a time beyond judgment, that God could do something in our midst that might bring us hope of something new being born among us. And so it's hard, in some ways, one might say we live in a time in which it's very hard to hear or see the laughter of grace. To believe in that possibility. And with the story of Sarah, the laughing mother, who truly becomes the mother of Isaac, whose very name means laughter, who becomes the mother of Jacob, of many children and grandchildren, she laughs at the impossibility of grace. Now, Frederick Buechner wrote a novel. He's a famous Presbyterian minister who's written a number of autobiographies. But he wrote a novel, and it told the story of Jacob, who we mentioned a few weeks ago. The title of the novel is The Son of Laughter. And in it is Jacob reflecting on his life. And in it, his father, Isaac, tells him, there's this quote from the book in which he says, and he calls Isaac, he doesn't call him Isaac, he calls him Laughter. And he says, Laughter told me, God is shielding us like a guttering wick, because the fire God is trying to start with us is a fire that the whole world will live to warm its hands by. God has lit in us a fire in the dark that will light the whole world home. So for a people who look for the face of a laughing mother, who believe in the impossibility of God's laughter and grace, we are called to seek that face and to hold on to that hope and be the ones who hold on to that fire that warms the world. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.